Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of Shmuel Aleph, the first book of Samuel, chapter 4b. We're doing the second half of chapter 4, which begins with verse 12. We learned of the terrible tragedy that occurred, the terrible defeat of the army of Israel again when they fought the Philistines, when they put their faith in the object of the Ark of the Covenant. It obviously did not help them, and 30,000 soldiers were lost. And the two sons of Eli, who had the prophecy to Samuel had been that they were going to die on the same day, they did. The prophecy was fulfilled. And this is where we left off last time, and we're going to pick up from verse 12. So, from the battlefield, Vayaretz Ish bin Yamin, an anonymous man who happened to be a member of the tribe of Benjamin, ran Mehamaracha, he ran from the battlefield, Vayavo Shilo Bayomahu, and he traveled on that day, that fateful day, he went to Shiloh to bring the terrible news. Umadov Kiruim, his clothing, his uniform was torn, Va'adama Rosho, and he had dirt on his head. Whether this dirt was a sign of mourning or whether this dirt was just a result of the battle that he had just been through is not relevant. But the point being that he was tattered and full of dirt and mud and so on. Vayavo vahine Eli, and he came to Shiloh, and behold, Eli the high priest was Yoshev al Kisei, was sitting on a chair, Yad derech mitzapeh, near the road, in a place where he would look out, like in a raised place where he looks out upon the road, to awaiting news of the battle. Of course, hoping that they would be triumphantly bringing the ark back to Shiloh, and so after being victorious in battle. Ki hayali bo, however, he was sitting there because his heart was chared, his heart was afraid, he was anxious, he was nervous. Alaron alakim, regarding the ark of God. Now again, the emphasis here is very deliberate. Eli was worried about the ark of God. What about his sons? What about the people? He's more worried about the object than the people, and this is something that's going to be repeated and emphasized as we read through this chapter here. Eli's concern was for the ark. Again, even Eli, even the high priest, who we have somewhat mixed bag of how to look. On the one hand, he seemed to be a nice man. He seemed to treat Shmuel nicely. He seemed to have some level of leadership. He was able to recognize, at first he suspected Hannah when she was praying, but eventually he was able to recognize his error and give her a blessing. So it's kind of a mixed bag. On the one, but he clearly was not up to the task of leadership. And clearly here it's being emphasized that his worry was more about the object of the Aron than the people and their welfare. And the man came to say in the city, so as he approached the tabernacle, he tells the people in the city of Shiloh, the ones that lived near the tabernacle, the terrible news. And the entire city started to cry in a terrible cry of mourning. And Eli heard from his vantage point, sitting at the entrance to the tabernacle, he heard the sounds of the cries, Vayomer, and he said, Me kol hehamon hazeh. What is this? The sound of all this mass of people, all this sound. V'yoyer mihar v'yavo v'yaged le'eli. So the person rushed through the town and quickly went and told Eli what had happened. The Eli at this time, ben tishimu shmona shana, he was 98 years old, so he was very old. Ve'enov kama, his eyes had stopped working. His eyes were kama, they were standing still. They were just staring blankly. V'lo yachol leros, he was not able to see, just staring blankly into the distance. Before, when we heard the story of Shmuel and his first prophecy, Eli's eyes were getting weak. He was hardly able to see. Now he's no longer able to see at all. Vayomer ha'ish al Eli. So this man said to Eli, Anochi, I, haba min ha'ma'aracha. One gets the idea that the emphasis on his blindness it seems to be, to some degree, a little bit of an extra. It's not really necessary for the story. I mean, it does help portray an image of an elderly man who's blind, which is part of the image that the verses are trying to say, but it also, the fact that it's emphasized here and in the story of Samuel, it's like, it's almost like Einav Kama, his eyes have stopped. He could no longer see, meaning he wasn't able to discern. He wasn't able to differentiate what's important. He didn't get it. That it's it's almost like the verse is saying it because it wants us to understand that Eli just didn't get it anymore. He didn't get what's important anymore. So the man said to Eli, this is verse 16, Anochi Abba min ha'maracha, I am the one who has come from the battlefield. Va'ani min ha'maracha nasti hayom, and I have fled from the battlefield today. Vayomer meha yohadavar beni. So Eli says nicely, he uses an endearing term, my son, what is it that happened? Vayan hamevaser, and the person bringing the news answered Eli, Vayomer, and he said, Nos Yisrael ifnei Plishtim, the people of Israel retreated and ran from in front of the Philistines. Vigam and also Magefah Gedolah Saba'am, there was a tremendous death, tremendous slaughter among the nation. So a lot of people died. You'd think this would be terrible, and even worse, Vigam Shneva Nechamesu, even your two sons died, Chofni Pinchas. But Aron Ha'elohim Nilkacha, and the ark of God has been taken captive. Vayehi, and here's the emphasis again, the verse 18. Kehazkiro et Aron Ha'elohim, when he mentioned the ark of God, then Vayipol Me'al Kakisei Achoranit, then he fell from his seat backwards. He just fell backwards in surprise, in tremendous agony. Ba'ad Yad Hashar, the seat that was near the gate where he was sitting. Vatishaver mafrakto vayamos, and his neck broke and he died. Kizakeno ish, because he was a very old man. V'chaved, and he was very heavy. He was overweight. V'hu shafat es Yisrael arba'am shana, and he had been the leader of the people of Israel for 40 years, and thus ended his leadership. The verse deliberately emphasized Kehazkiro et Haron Elohim, when he mentioned the loss of the ark, that's when he fell. Not when he heard about 30,000 soldiers dead. Not when he heard even about his two sons dying. But when he heard about the Aron Elohim being taken, the ark, that's when he fell backward. Again, emphasizing that Eli was more concerned about the ark than he was about the people. So, and Eli had a daughter-in-law, Eshet Pinchas, who was the wife of Pinchas, who was one of his sons. Hara Lolat, she was pregnant and almost ready to give birth. She was near the end of her pregnancy. Vatishma Tashmua, when she heard the news, Al El Hilokach Aron Ho Elohim, that the Aron, the Ark of God, had been taken. Again, emphasizing that what news was the worst to her was the fact that the Aron was taken. And also, Umeis Chamiya V'isha, the fact that her husband and father-in-law passed away. Vatichran, she went into labor, Vatelet, and she gave birth, Ki Nepchu Alea Tzirel, because her labor pains began. Now, Ukeis Musa, and at the time of her death, Vatidaberna and Itzavosolea, the women that were standing and attending to her said, as she was dying, presumably as she was bleeding and her life was going, Altiri, don't be afraid, Kivenya, don't be worried when you go off to the next world because you have a son. Velo ansa velo shasaliba. She did not answer them, and she didn't really care about that very not such great comfort. Vatikral anar, and in her final words, she called to the boy a name, Lemar, saying Ichavod. She called him Ichavod, which literally translates there is no honor. In other words, she basically called him you're a shame. That's how she named her son. Lamar, saying the following message: Gola chavod mi Yisrael. The honor has left Israel, El Hilokach Aron Elohim, because the ark of God has been taken. Ve'el Chamiya V'isha, and also my father-in-law and husband died. The order of importance here, again, the primary thing is El Hilokach Aron Elohim, because the Aron was taken, and the father-in-law and husband died. Again, this emphasis on the ark being the tragedy here, not the loss of life. Vatomer, and then again to emphasize, in case you didn't get the point, that her faith was in she was mostly upset about the ark, just like her father-in-law was upset about the ark, just like the people had put their faith in the ark. Gola kavod mi Israel, honor has left Israel, ki nilkach aron olim, because the ark of God has been taken. And those were her final words. Again, about the ark, not about the death of her husband, not about the death of her father-in-law, not about the death of 30,000 soldiers, not about anything regarding the proper lives they're supposed to live in honor of God, but the ark, the magical ark, has been taken, which was the tragedy that this people perceived, completely blind to what the true tragedy really was. This concludes chapter 4. Chapter 5 is going to be another interesting story, teaching us also lessons about the uselessness of having faith and superstition in things rather than in God. Thank you so much for studying this together. Looking forward to studying chapter 5 and, of course, the rest of the book of Samuel together.